reclined at table. The Pharisee was astonished to see that Jesus did not first wash before dinner. And the Lord said to him, "Now you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You fools, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give his alms, those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you." This is the second of 3 dinners with Pharisees that Luke reports. We've already had one of them, going back to Luke chapter 7, verse 36. That was when Jesus was asked to eat with one of the Pharisees, and the woman came in who began to anoint Jesus and wash his feet. She used her tears as water and her hair as a drying cloth, and she was honoring Jesus in that way. The Pharisee took offense at that. So that was the first Pharisee dinner. There's going to be another one coming up in Luke chapter 14 and verse 1. That passage reads this way: "One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully." So we get the idea that these dinners with Pharisees had a couple of levels to them. One was their curiosity about Jesus as a rabbi and as a teacher. What was he teaching? What was he doing? But also with that line from chapter 14 and verse 1, we can also see that his dinner hosts already had a prejudice against him, the things that he was teaching, and they had some nefarious motivations for being around Jesus and having them in their home, hoping to catch him in some controversial moment that they could exploit, as they had become anti-Jesus, even calling him a demon. So there's probably a little bit of both, some curiosity. None of them seem really ready to receive what Jesus is teaching, but they are curious about that. But then they also are bringing with them a skepticism and a prejudice against Jesus himself. This particular time is no different. This begins while Jesus was speaking. I'll remind you of the last paragraph in last week's lesson. The last paragraph in last week's lesson was about light and how Jesus is the light. Jesus' teaching is light. And yet there are people who, rather than having their eyes adjusted and open and seeking the light, have the dark eye, have the evil eye, and they are celebrating darkness rather than light. So Jesus was already talking about people who preferred the darkness to light. And as he was speaking that, he gets this invitation in verse 37 to a Pharisee's house to dine with him. And we're going to find that darkness was the cloud that was over this particular Pharisee's house and his hosting of Jesus. So Jesus was speaking. A Pharisee invited Jesus to dine with him, and so Jesus went and reclined at table. You know, one of the early, this came on early in the Gospel of Luke, one of the early criticisms of Jesus was that he would go eat with tax collectors and sinners. From the Pharisee perspective, that was not a good thing to do. But notice that Jesus is open to all invitations. Yes, he did go eat with tax collectors and sinners. And as he said, this is where I need to be. It's the sick who need a physician. But whenever the Pharisees, who are confrontational with him and critical of him and skeptical and even looking to cause him some harm and making terrible accusations, when the Pharisees invite Jesus to dinner, well, he goes with them too. So So Jesus is ministering as he can to every crowd. So Jesus went to this Pharisee's house and reclined there. And the first thing that happened was, verse 38 says, that the Pharisee was astonished. And what astonished him was to see that Jesus did not wash before dinner. The law had a good deal to say about washings, that the Levites in particular, but also the general populace, there were washings that people were to make when they were entering the temple, when they were going into holy places, that sort of thing. But the traditions that had built up around the Pharisees and the lawyers included a series of other washings, and it went to before every meal, and there were certain ways that it had to be done. Those things were not included in the law. Those were the traditions that had been built up among the Pharisees, but they regarded those traditions as equal to the law in their own practice. So here was this Pharisee, and maybe he did have some genuine curiosity to know what Jesus was teaching, this miracle worker, this wonderful teacher, this master teacher that he had heard about, and invited him to his home. But immediately, things got off on the wrong foot, because he noticed, even before the meal started, Jesus did not exercise the traditional washings that the Pharisees thought were necessary. And so he was really taken aback by that, astonished about that. The one story that I thought of that just helps us to see these things. You know, sometimes, when there is a spiritual leader, someone involved in spiritual leadership, there are some high expectations from the general populace about that. This Pharisee, if he was looking at Jesus as someone who, given the crowds that came to hear Jesus teach, given the miracles that he had heard about, he had some high expectations about Jesus and how Jesus would do. And the first thing that he noticed was Jesus did not do the traditional, it was not unlawful, but he didn't do the traditional Pharisees washing in it, and it just astonished him and shocked him. So years ago, when Patty and I were dating, and we were teenagers, my dad was the preacher in Vicksburg. Patty, one time, having been to our house and seeing us in a family moment, went home and with great surprise told her mother that Brother May, that would be my dad, Brother May had a hole in his sock. His toe was sticking out, a hole in the sock. And she was kind of taken aback by that. The preacher has a hole in the sock. So this is not unlike that, except to the Pharisee on a stronger level. Jesus didn't wash. He didn't do the traditional washing before he ate. And we might think that this was intentional from Jesus. We have read, and we're going to read some more about how Jesus performed miracles on Sabbath. And it does seem like sometimes Jesus understood that the exaggerated Sabbath laws of the Pharisees and the exaggerated washings laws of the Pharisees, their traditions, were hot button topics for them. And so it kind of seems like Jesus would push those buttons just to draw out a conversation in order to go somewhere about religious traditions and their usefulness or non-usefulness, the harm that they do, the good that they do. So maybe Jesus was intentional about not washing before this dinner. Maybe he meant to astonish this Pharisee. But regardless, the Pharisee was astonished. And Jesus, maybe he noticed the look on the Pharisee's face when Jesus skipped the washing. Or we do find, and this line is used several times in Luke and in the other Gospels, that Jesus always knew what another person's thoughts were. He knew the hearts of all those. He could see into the heart of the person that he was with. The way that John puts it in the Gospel of John in chapter 1, Jesus knows what's in a person. So whether it was reading the Pharisee's astonished face or whether it was looking into his heart and mind, Jesus addressed the very situation that was disturbing the Pharisee, even though the Pharisee might not have mentioned it. Jesus then brought it up because he knew this is what the Pharisee was talking about. And Jesus had a lesson prepared that he wanted to deliver. That maybe was the reason among the reasons that he skipped the washing. Because the Lord said to him, seeing the astonishment in the Pharisee, Jesus said to him, "Now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you were full of greed and wickedness." That might seem like it's a pretty harsh statement to make first thing when you sit down at dinner with your host. But remember, they had recently called Jesus a demon, a prince of demons. So that context is already there. And Jesus does recognize, yes, he's at this Pharisee's house, but it's also a teaching moment, a confrontational kind of teaching, but a teaching sort of moment. And the lesson that the Pharisees, all Pharisees, needed to learn was that it is the inward, the motivations, the intentions, the heart upon which God looks. And they were so utterly and single-mindedly focused upon their traditions and the keeping of rituals, the appearance of what they were doing. That was what they were looking at. Jesus needed to bump them off of that. By the way, it's noted by any number of people that the Pharisees do come off in the Gospels because of their opposition to Jesus. And indeed, they were a big reason Jesus ended up nailed to a cross. That the Pharisees, as a group of people, did at least have in their mind somewhere that they were doing all the things that they were doing in order to please God, in order to honor God in some way. But the path that they had been on for as long as they had been on it had just taken them into a realm of being concerned, again, with appearance, with the outside, with the ritual, with getting those things right, rather than having an understanding of the nature of God and matching the Spirit of God with their own spirit, matching the heart of God with their own heart, understanding the fulfillment of the law. They knew the law, but they didn't always get the fulfillment of the law. They knew not to murder. They didn't know not to hate. So, as Jesus addressed in the Sermon on the Mount. So this was an important conversation that Jesus needed to have with these Pharisees. And maybe he had decided that it was a confrontational kind of sermon that they needed if any change was going to be made. And it doesn't sound like much change was made, but maybe confrontation was the best path for that. So Jesus said, "Now you Pharisees, cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside," and he already moves to their heart and their minds, "you were full of greed and wickedness." I read one translation that put it this way: inside you were full of rapacity and evil. Greed is, of course, a motivation for the material, for money in particular, that kind of greed. To be rapacious is to do that in really an aggressive manner. So, so greed is bad enough on its own, but if you're really aggressive about your greed, then you can attach a longer word to that. So, and so Jesus does use some strong language as he speaks to them about their greed and their wickedness, which, this would be the Pharisee, in talking about washing the dish and the cup. He's talking about cleanliness, but Jesus says, you're talking about dishes and cups, and not just dishes and cups, but the outside of dishes and cups. I'm here to tell you about the inward person and what needs to be there. And he accused them then of greed and wickedness. So in verse 40, you fools, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? So God is concerned with the outward and the inward. God does want there to be behaviors that are righteous and godly. But God also wants behind the righteous and godly behaviors to be the heart that is the heart of God, that's honoring God, that's not putting on a show, that doesn't, and this is what we're going to get into today, doesn't fall into hypocrisy, but instead is genuine, with the inside, the heart, the mind being what it should be, so that the outside then is what it should be as well. God made both. And in verse 41, we have this, I regard it as a peculiar sort of statement. But Jesus says, but give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. Jesus had already accused the Pharisees as a group of being greedy, rapacious even. Now Jesus talks about almsgiving, about being generous. Alms is money, so you give your money. Jesus is going to get into, in the next paragraph, about their tithing practice and what they do with that. So when Jesus says that they should give as alms those things that are within, whatever monies they give, whatever coin they bring to the treasury of the temple, and the way that they are generous, if they're going to be generous towards others, overcoming their greed in that way. That it's good to do it with money, but it's also it does sound like here Jesus is saying there's some alms within. So that may not be legal tender in the way that we think about it, but it is generosity, and it is a giving, and it is a gift of ourselves and our energies, our love for others. So Jesus wants to see that from the Pharisees. He wants to see something beyond the ritual and beyond the outward. And he wants almsgiving to come from within and be the kinds of gifts that are of the nature and spirit of God. And Jesus says, and if that happens, if you can get there and that happens, then everything is clean for you. If we are in our worship and honor and service of God, if we are actually doing those things out of a heart that is for God, that honors God, that the love of God with our heart, soul, and mind, loving neighbor as self, when those things are our motivations, then yes, it demonstrates a clean inside, but also if we have a clean inside, the outside is going to be clean as well. So the Pharisees were concerned with the outside and getting it clean, and the inside remained dirty. But Jesus says if you'll clean up the inside. If you'll wash the inside, the outside comes out clean as well in that. So Jesus wants them to go deeper. The Pharisees were great practicers of religion, but Jesus wants them to go deeper than the rituals and the outward practices to the inward and the heart. That was the great Pharisee problem. So based on that, Jesus issued 3 woes to the Pharisees. You might be thinking of Matthew chapter 23, where Matthew records a series of woes. I think there's 7 of them there in Matthew 23. Luke is going to give 3 woes that Jesus spoke to the Pharisees, and in a moment, 3 more woes to another group that we're going to talk about in a moment. But he gives 3 woes to the Pharisees, and here is what Jesus says on this occasion. So reading now, verse 42 through 44. But woe to you Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Woe to you Pharisees, for you love the best seat in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it. So in woe number 1, Jesus mentions that the Pharisees occupy themselves in their tithing with even the non-commercial items. It would be like if a Pharisee had a farm and from his crop that he would harvest each fall would do the proper tithing, the 10%. There was the general 10%. There were other gifts that were required by the law and those sorts of things. So you would have your farm, and you would keep the books, and whatever your profit was, then 1/10 of that, plus whatever other offerings were required, then you would give those things. But these Pharisees were so meticulous in their tithing that they wouldn't just take the commercial wheat that they were growing, the commercial part of the farm, but if they had a little garden, and in their garden had some mint that they could put in there too, just some little mint leaves or those kinds of things. They were so meticulous about their tithing, they would take the value of every 10th mint leaf and say, well, I owe that to God too. When God wasn't looking as closely at that as they were, but they were meticulous about that. And so Jesus says you are so own yourself about your tithing that you count even the smallest non-commercial thing, the mint that you make for your to give your food some flavor. And by the way, Jesus doesn't say you shouldn't do that. He says, well, yeah, you should do that. Yeah, you should do that. But there's some other things that you should not leave undone. And what they had left undone were, as Jesus puts it here, then they left out or neglected justice and love of God. So going back to the almsgiving that Jesus had mentioned, they were pretty adept at writing a check, but not at contributing their heart and giving from the heart. So Jesus mentions that to them, that there are, in the Matthew 23 passage that's similar, Jesus calls this justice and love of God the weightier matters. You're doing the minor things, but you're not doing the big things. You're not doing the major things. So they should be people who pursue justice and love of God. The second woe is, woe to the Pharisees, for you love the best seat in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplace. This is a status thing. They one of the things the Pharisees liked about being a Pharisee and being known in the temple and respected, and in that group that is known as a group to be especially religious, they liked that people recognized them and bowed to them and waved at them and called them by name and by title. They were really into all that, and that's what brought them pleasure. It was not the relationship and appreciation of God that brought them delight. It was when people would say, "Oh, Dr. Pharisee," that was what brought them delight. So Jesus makes that mention to them. Humility and servant ministry were absent in what they were doing. And then this is an interesting one, verse 44. "Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it." The Pharisees tried their best to practice cleanliness in every situation. And one of the things that in their Phariseeism, in their lawfulness, one of the things that scared them the most was somehow coming in contact with something unclean and being unaware of it. So if they could see the uncleanness, they would stay away from it. But what bothered them in their soul was, well, what if I don't see the uncleanness, and that uncleanness somehow attaches to me, and I don't even know it? So for that reason, they put up barriers and walls and all of that sort of thing. And what Jesus says here in this particular woe is one of the things that could happen. Suppose there's a dead body in the ground. There's no marker to mark that it's a dead body. One of the things that would make you unclean in the Pharisaical system was to step on the grave. If you step on the grave, you become unclean. But what if somebody's buried there and there's no marker and you don't know it, and you step on it and you've become unclean and you don't even know it? That really bothered them. What Jesus says to the Pharisees in relation to the people and the populace who are supposed to be learning from them at the temple, learning from their teachings, learning by the examples, Jesus says, you are the unmarked grave. You're not helping people to be clean. As a matter of fact, people come around you and they unknowingly walk away unclean just because they have given you this deference in the marketplace, and they've listened to the things that you have said. And so Jesus says, you actually, rather than staying clean yourself, you are the unmarked grave that makes others unclean when they are around you because of your great hypocrisy is what comes. So those are the three woes that Jesus gives to the Pharisees as a group, and this conversation comes up next. One of the lawyers, you're familiar in the Gospels with the scribes, the Pharisees, the lawyers, and the scribes. The lawyers and scribes were people who were experts in the law, and a good deal of the teaching of the law fell to them. Not every Pharisee was one of the lawyers of the temple, but the lawyers of the temple, they may not all be Pharisees, but they all kind of went hand in hand and were interested in the same sort of thing, which unfortunately, as Jesus is pointing out, has to do with appearance and outward religion and those kinds of things. So there was a lawyer, one of the teachers of the law, one of the experts in the law. And by the way, when he would refer to himself as as a lawyer and expert in Scripture, he also is an expert in the traditions. You know those washings we were talking about earlier? He's the one who could tell you, no, here's how you do it. So, and could tell you just how to do it, how not to do it, and those kinds of things. So these are the lawyers. So there's a lawyer who's been hearing Jesus give these woes to this Pharisee. And so the lawyer says in verse 45, "Teacher, in saying these things, you insult us also." So rather than seeing Jesus' teaching as a corrective that would be helpful, they are receiving the teaching of Jesus as an insult. And the lawyer says, but as you insult the Pharisees, us lawyers, we believe and hold to and practice the same things in the same ways. So your insults towards them, as he puts it, then are falling on us as well. So let's read what Jesus says about that, beginning in verse 46, and we'll read to the end of the chapter. One of the lawyers answered him, "Teacher, in saying these things, you insult us also." And Jesus said, "Well, woe to you lawyers also, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed. So you are witnesses, and you consent to the deeds of your fathers, for they killed them, and you build their tombs. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be required of this generation. Woe to you lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who were entering." And as he went away from there, the scribes and the Pharisees began to press him hard and to provoke him to speak about many things, lying in wait for him to catch him in something he might say. So the lawyer says, well, I've heard your woes to the Pharisees. That insults me too. And Jesus says, well, I got some woes for you too. And the first one is that in your teaching of the law, that you load people up with burdens that are difficult to bear. And yet Jesus says, but if someone were to look closely, you're not even practicing what you preach or what you teach the others to do. Jesus would say things like, about his own teaching, and the teachings of a rabbi were sometimes referred to as a yoke. You could wear the yoke of Rabbi Hillel, or you could wear the yoke of Rabbi Jesus, and that meant that you were that person's disciple and you followed them. Jesus said about his own yoke, his own teaching, come, you that are heavy laden, you that are burdened, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy, my yoke is light. The Apostle John found it necessary to say in his letters that the teachings of Jesus are not burdensome for you. Oftentimes people see the commands of God to be burdensome, to be joy-killing, to be restrictive in such a way that is a detriment to our pursuit of happiness, when actually the instruction and the commandments of God, when you see them for what they are and the truth of them, and not the traditions of the fathers that are heavy and burdensome, but when you get into the commands of God, it's for our good, and it's to make our life better, and it's for our happiness and for our protection, and we'll not only be better people, but we'll live happier and longer lives if we do these things. So Jesus says, you burden people with your teachings, and then you don't even live up to those teachings yourself. Then the second woe was Jesus said in teaching the history of Israel, the lawyers exalt the prophets of the past. So they would say, oh, we're big Isaiah fans. We're big Jeremiah fans. We're big Jonah fans. And Jesus would say, well, what about John the Baptist? You weren't a big fan of his. And what about me? You say I'm a prince of demons. You're not a big fan of me. And so Jesus is making the point that as their fathers persecuted the prophets, because they did, their fathers did not like what Jeremiah had to say or Isaiah had to say. And so they persecuted them. Some of the prophets they killed. And Jesus says, so you are, you act like you exalt the prophets of old, but just like your fathers, you reject the prophets who are among you, bringing a word from God. And Jesus says, in fact, you are so complicit in that. Yes, your fathers killed the prophets, and you build a tomb, like a cathedral. You build a cathedral. You say to honor the prophet, but actually it's just a witness against you that you are complicit in your father's evil deeds because they had them killed. And Jesus mentions, this is always an interesting thing to me, Jesus says, the previous generations persecuted everyone from Abel to Zechariah. Abel was the first ever martyr of righteousness. Abel offered a sacrifice that pleased God, and Cain killed him for it. Zechariah's story is told in the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 24. Zechariah was a prophet of God who spoke up to the people in a day of evil practices. And they stoned him right there at the temple. He was teaching in the temple, and they stoned him. That's 2 Chronicles 24, verses 20 to 22. In the Hebrew Scriptures, 2 Chronicles is the last book in the collection. The way that we arrange our Bibles in the Old Testament, Malachi is the last. But in the Hebrew Scriptures, the minor prophets, as we call them, are tacked on to the end of the major prophets. But 1st and 2nd Chronicles is the end. So the last martyr of righteousness in the Hebrew collection of Scripture was this Zechariah. And so Jesus says you act like you exalt the prophets of God, and you kind of act like you do the old ones, but God has sent new ones, John the Baptist, me, the apostles, and us you persecute just like your fathers did. And so then, as we read in verse 53, this was a confrontational teaching moment, and it just, at least among the Pharisees, made them hate Jesus even more. So one more thing, chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, one more Pharisee thing. In the meantime, when so many thousands of people had gathered together that they were trampling one another, he began to say to his disciples first, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops. So Jesus warns his disciples not to fall into the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and lawyers, the hypocrisy of being concerned with the ritual and the outward appearance and not the inside, with majoring in the minors of meticulous tithing, but leaving out the justice and the love and mercy of God, with claiming to be someone who honors the prophet of God, the prophets of old, but you persecute and reject the prophets. Jesus says, beware of that hypocrisy. Don't let it hypocrisy is always a threat to religion. So beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So next week, then, we will be moving on to our next lesson, which will be fears and fools. We've had Pharisees and lawyers. Next week it'll be fears and fools from the rest of chapter 12.